temperatures of this winter. But I'm very pleased this morning to be able to introduce Dr. Pamela Robinson. Pamela is the director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University in Toronto. Throughout her career as a planner, her research and practice is focused on complex, emergent challenges that Canadian communities face. A lot of this work has looked at urban sustainability issues with a particular focus on cities and climate change, and the use of open data and civic technology to support open government transformations. Her current research focuses on the question, who is planning the Canadian smart city? Actually, on the drive out here this morning, she was telling me she's done 42 public talks in the last 18 months on this topic. I'm not supposed to say that apparently, but I think it's impressive. So, 42 in 18 months, that's a lot of slide decks. Since 2010, Pamela has written a regular column for Spacing magazine where she writes about equity, technology, and civic engagement in Canadian cities. She's a member of the Waterfront Toronto's Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, an advisor on the Toronto Public Libraries Innovation Council, and is a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum for the Government of Canada's Open Government Partnership. They stay up all night making that nice and concise.
So sexy.
Yeah. I also just wanted to note, because it's sort of relevant to where we are today, she was the editor of two books, Urban Sustainability, Reconnecting Space and Place, and particularly relevant now, teaching a scholarship, preparing students for professional practice in community services. So please join me in welcoming Pamela Robinson.
I'm the bionic speaker talking about smart cities. I have 2 microphones in my pocket. It's a bit like being a cowboy. When I was asked to title my talk, the first question I asked is, am I allowed to use profanity in the title? Being Winnipeg and proper, I was told no. In Toronto, maybe I might be able to get away with it. So the future is a bunch of punctuation. What I want to talk about today are some emergent phenomena, mostly technology and data-driven, that have huge implications, I think, for planning and design. But I'm also going to use one analog, really kind of real-world, everyday thing at the very end to talk about the work I do. Here's a list of some things that I'm involved with. I share this only to help you situate where I'm coming from. I'm not a hardcore designer, but I am a planner who works with designers. I also work with computer scientists and lawyers quite a bit. In a lot of the work I'm doing recently around technology in cities, I'm often the only urban planner in the room. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm saying it because we need more people like me and like you in spaces talking about technology in cities and data governance, because people who can work at multi-scalar ways of thinking and doing, people who understand the difference between abstract thinking and placemaking, people who can toggle between creative and practical and technical are vitally needed in these spaces. And the ethics that we bring to our work, which is largely, at least in the case of planners, that we are to work in the public interest, which is also a principle that's shared across design professions, is desperately needed in these spaces around technology and data governance and design and planning of cities. So the central question, I think, that's driving this new smart city wave that's taking the world is, if you look at how smart cities are marketed, there's a huge emphasis on efficiency, that if we use this technology, our cities will be more efficient. And efficiency in government also aligns with austere government environments around trying to make things cheaper and to work better. I think for all of us who work in the shaping of real spaces for people and thinking about quality of life and sustainability and inclusion, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what roles can technology and data play in the shaping of communities? And so at the most global sense, there's really interesting momentum, I think, around the Sustainable Development Goals. How many of you have actively interacted with the Sustainable Development Goals in your work or in your practice? They're not, hands up high? All right, how many of you ever paid any attention to the Millennium Development Goals? Not as many. There's something happening around the SDGs that's really interesting, I think, and it's mostly, I think, around SDG 11, which focuses on communities. So there's this natural urban presence in these global development goals that I think is capturing, it's certainly in Canadian communities, the attention of people who shape spaces in our world. In your own region and in your own city, there are also conversations happening around a new regional plan, which I think is really interesting. Yesterday I was super lucky. I got a chance to spend some time in studio with the planning students working on a regional plan. And your regional plan presents this really interesting conversation, I think, for your region to focus about. And there's a question about what role can technology and data play, but certainly in the Our Winnipeg plan too, with a focus on a city that works, a city that will be sustainable, and a city that advances high quality of life. There are also possible questions about the role that technology and data will play. Certainly, anyone interacting in either of these spaces, you will see vendors coming and trying to sell you their stuff with the proponents saying that it should make things better. I hope that you're already thinking critically about both opportunities and constraints, and maybe by the end of today, you'll have some new things to think about. In Canada right now, there are two really big movements happening. The one on the bottom is the one closest to me at home. This is the Quayside project that's being developed by Waterfront Toronto in partnership with Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, which is also known as a Google sister company. But also importantly, there's the Canadian Smart Cities Challenge. How many of you have heard of the Canadian Smart Cities Challenge before? Hands up higher? Okay, a few of you. So for those of you who haven't, the Government of Canada in 2017 announced a $300 million innovation challenge to take place over 3 phases. In 2017 through 2019, the first series of money was given out. The 5 plans that I'm showing here are the 5 finalist plans from the largest municipalities trying to win the $50 million prize. In May of 2019, the City of Montreal won for its Smart City Plan. But communities small and large from coast to coast to coast, some were rural, some were Indigenous, some were large cities like Toronto and Mississauga and Edmonton and Calgary. Communities were trying to bid to win the prize money and Montreal won. So, I'm sorry, we're seeing interesting experimentation happening around smart cities in Canada, but the idea of how do we actually make this work is a really interesting challenge. And I keep coming back to one of my favorite stupid guilty pleasures. How many of you watched the TV show Nailed It? Is anybody a baker in the room? If you don't know what this is, they put forward this really fancy thing, which is like the Christmas house on the left, and then amateur bakers, who I think they've actually recruited to be kind of sucky, crappy bakers and designers, try to mimic it. And so the left is the aspiration, and on the right is the version that normal humans can deliver. This dichotomy and tension is actually not that far off with affection to where we're at with smart city work right now. There are big goals and aspirations. The reality is much harder. And so as I talk about the examples that I'm going to give you, I want you to think about the scale where your practice sits. Some of you work in design in very detailed ways. You're thinking about, the way door hinges interact with door frames. You're like working at very small scales. Some people like me, as an urban planner who looks at weird stuff from the future, I'm on the other end where I'm in really fuzzy timelines and fuzzy spaces trying to figure out what's coming next. And everybody probably falls in between. And so as I share some examples of future technological change that are coming, I'm going to try to speak across scales because I know that we're a room full of architects and interior designers and landscape architects and planners and other people more broadly interested in design principles. So I'm going to try to work across scales. So here's the first of a series of examples I want to raise to get us thinking about what the role of technology and data could be. The first example I'm going to draw from, this image comes from the Quayside Plan, the Master Innovation Development Plan that Sidewalk Labs delivered to Waterfront Toronto last summer. And it shows you in the bubbles 5 different generalized technology systems that are related to the built form of this 12-acre community. So one of them is an underground delivery system. One of them relates up at the top to modular construction and experimentations with how that might work to reduce building costs and also to create more flexible and adaptable building spaces. At the bottom, there's a goal that all the parking will be hidden underground with a goal of reducing single automobile use with other mobility options. They talk about radical mixed use. They have a software platform called Seed, which is intended to track noise, occupancy levels, smells, heat, cooling, and different types of uses inside spaces to understand if there are new ways of mixing land uses. And then the last one is adaptable building typologies, where they're experimenting with new ways of delivering building infrastructure inside buildings so that spaces can be more flexible and nimble inside buildings. So for example, one of the technologies that they're piloting, if they can get it approved, is a new way of delivering water to meet fire code through sprinklers. If you think about the way buildings are built right now, lots of the infrastructure is hardwired. The electricity is hardwired, the sprinkler systems are hardwired, and those things get in the way of moving walls around them. So they're experimenting with different ways of making those kinds of things happen. The other thing that's interesting across the project as a whole, and you probably know about this, is they're big advocates of trying to build taller with timber, mass timber production, as a way of using a more sustainable type of building product, but also trying to spark economic development opportunities in Canadian communities. So all of these building technologies have implications for the way we think. And the way this project is being advanced, there are technology solutions that come with the different types of experimentation in building technology. And so I'm just going to pick the underground delivery system as one example. How many of you have an Amazon Prime account? Hands up? Yeah, okay, a lot of you, yeah. More of you have that than knew about the Smart City Challenge. Okay, yeah, so cancel it, says our colleague over here. So with the delivery of more things coming faster, one of the things we're seeing when we're designing buildings, and I hope that you're thinking about this if that's the work you do, but also in the way we're designing streets, is that we need new places to put stuff at ground level in buildings. Okay? What used to happen was that things would come through the post or you would go buy them and bring them home yourself. But now what we're seeing is the arrival of all this stuff on a daily basis, and it needs to go somewhere. And in some buildings, they're using a concierge system or a digital doorbell system like Ring to give people access to allow people to put things inside your unit. But in other places, the stuff has to sit somewhere temporarily until you come and pick it up. And it's not always off-site, sometimes it's on-site. It's changing the way buildings work. It'll be interesting to see if they go forward, because what they're proposing is to use a series of automated delivery robots underground to start to help deliver things. What does that logistics work like? How do people who aren't from the site, who are delivering things, get access to it? Are there extra fees charged? But what does the design of the building look? And how is the design of the building going to change over time as these kinds of systems evolve and change? So any one of these new building technologies has myriad implications for planning and design that are worth thinking about, completely aside from the data piece, which I'm going to get to. Now moving above ground, let's talk about the way in which the public realm is going to be impacted by the changing nature of technology. One of the things that we see a lot is a discussion about autonomous connected vehicles that are largely electric. I was thinking when Richard and I came to campus today that plugging in cars takes on a very different meaning in Winnipeg than it does in other parts of the country where it's not quite so cold. You're quite used to plugging in your cars, but they're not electric. Other people are going to have to get used to what it means to charge their electric cars. But if you look at this street profile, one of the things about that site that's interesting to me from a planning perspective is that they're trying to blend the ways in which the right-of-ways are being used. And so you see small vehicles. You see people on bicycles. There aren't people on scooters there, but if this was now, you'd start to see people on electric scooters. You see people walking. You also see these hexagonal pavers that are designed to make the maintenance of the street and the laying of infrastructure set up differently. So the public realm looks different in this kind of space than it does in other communities, and that's got interesting implications for all of us. And there are two forms, that's me on a scooter, there are two forms of technology I think that are coming right now, if not tomorrow, that are really important for us to think about as planners and designers. The first one is electric scooters. I don't actually know where Winnipeg's at. Where are you at with electric scooters? Not here yet? Are they coming anytime soon? We have potholes too, but we have them in Ontario starting soon. There are tons of debates around scooters. The obvious ones are, where are people going to ride them? Has anyone ridden an electric scooter before? Yeah, okay. They're a fun and curious thing to ride. I actually didn't enjoy it very much, but that's because I'm a nerdy planner who needs to get a life. When you ride them, you're moving at a funny speed, because they're electric powered and they're quiet. And so these present challenges for everyday design of public spaces, because if you ride them on the sidewalk, most of the things that happen on the sidewalk, except for people using assistive mobility devices, all of the movement on the sidewalk is at the speed of human energy, right? You're either walking, or maybe dog energy or cat energy, but you're either walking or you're pushing something with wheels, or you're a little kid on a bike and everyone just gives you space because you're not moving very fast. Electric-powered scooters move much faster on the sidewalk, and so it disrupts the natural rhythm of the sidewalk and it makes it complicated. They're also quiet. We listen a lot to understand how we can move between spaces on the sidewalk. So if you're moving and you're walking slowly and you want to move over, if you hear someone coming up behind you, you may wait or you may look. It's very difficult to hear the scooter behind you. So the sidewalk makes them a tricky place to go. They also don't work very well in bike lanes, in my experience. If you're a cyclist, how many of you are regular cyclists, like you bike to campus? Have you ever tried to bike in a bike lane with a scooter? E-bikes are hard enough. These are even trickier, again, because they're moving at a different speed. So we have this new technology that people are proposing to be a last mile solution, a significant, some proponents would say, advantage to trying to change our mobility patterns. But we don't actually have a natural place for them to go. So there's an interesting challenge, super practical. Technology from almost tomorrow, here right now, not entirely sure what to do. Then in the middle picture, there's this question of what do you do with them and where do they go? City of Montreal, with its pilot project, had designated scooter parking places. One of my friends from the Government of Ontario just privately messaged me the other day after the pilot project came open and said his side hustle job is he's going to go start fishing scooters out of Lake Ontario and reselling them to make money once they come, because people chuck them in places. In Amsterdam, if you talk to any transportation planners in Amsterdam, they'll talk to you about how full the canals are of people's bicycles, shared bicycles in private. People just chuck things in funny places. When people throw them in the rights of ways, for anybody with a visual challenge navigating public space, they create a trip hazard. They create clutter. And so there are interesting discussions about where to put them. And then there's the challenge of the delivery robots. On campuses across the United States, like Carnegie Mellon, Amazon's experimenting with the delivery of food to students using delivery robots. And they're deliberately designed to be cute and not look, like it's kind of fun, right, the way it looks. They're not meant to be menacing, but robots are another form of electric-powered vehicle that needs a place to go. It's hard enough, at least where I live, to get to work. If I have to start biking around robots, I'm going to be kind of crabby by the time I get to campus to work. And so these two examples of right here, right now technology are already challenging our public realm assumptions on top of all of the other things that we're trying to work with. And then there's other form of technology that we need to start to get our head around. And these start to relate to not just the physical technology itself, but the algorithms behind it and the data challenges that come along with it. And so I'll use 3 examples briefly here. The first one up on the left is the robotic police officer that Dubai is experimenting with. There's this annual Smart City Expo every November in Barcelona. Has anyone here ever been to that? It's a really, if you're interested in smart cities, it's like the smart city circus. But when you go, people bring their smart city technology with them. And Moscow, Dubai, there are robotic police officers. If you live in a city like mine and a city like yours, and you start to think about the relationship of human police to racialized communities of people and equity-seeking communities of people, we know that human to human, we already have challenges with inclusion in police. What happens when we try to program an algorithm to take the place of police officers and let a robot do the work instead? It presents tremendous challenges from a public interest point of view. AI proponents are talking about using artificial intelligence to make cities smarter. You can't read a trade magazine without someone talking about the promise of machine learning, advanced computational analysis, and big data sets to make cities better. We need to be concerned. On the bottom, this picture is actually, I'm going to go Toronto Raptors. This is the Raptors Big Data Center. They use a big data analytics center to help figure out how to make our team play better. Since we've won 12 in a row, maybe the computers are winning on that one. But when you scale this up to the city level, in cities like, say, Rio de Janeiro with its Situation Room, the more you try to create an operating system for a city, the greater the challenges become. And one of the reasons why this big challenge exists is because largely the algorithms that make the decisions are hidden inside a black box. And they're hidden inside a black box because that's how these companies make money. But as planners and as designers, we're quite used to being able to see inside the boxes of decision making. We're used to looking at evidence to ask if it's effective or not, or if it's representative enough. But it's really tricky with algorithms and algorithmic governance because we don't actually know what's happening inside the machine. The other thing that we don't have access to necessarily is the kind of data that's being used to train the machines and the kind of data that the machine is using to make its evaluation processes. So in a city like mine, where roughly 87% of Torontonians have regular access to the internet, if there's a data set that's come from people's mobile phones, we can't actually tell you which percentage of the city that data set represents, because not all internet access is coming from mobile phones. We also don't know the demographic profiles of the people who are giving the data. And so if you start to think about whose data is training the machines and whose data is being used to generate the outputs, we have a whole series of problems in the work that we're going to do if we're going to design and plan in the public interest. Does anyone know Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality? Is this book, who's read this book? Anyone? Okay, I highly recommend anyone who's interested in technology in cities that you take a look at her book. I'll read you a quote. The cheerleaders of the new data regime rarely acknowledge the impacts of digital decision-making on the poor and the working class people. This myopia is not shared by those in the lower economic hierarchy who often see themselves as targets rather than beneficiaries of these systems. I'm going to put this in a more blunt way. When Indigenous communities of people in Canada have shared their data, it has often been weaponized against them. Okay, we have a terrible track record of taking data from people who are poor, people who are marginalized, people who are racialized, and people who are seeking equity, and turning it around and using it against them. So if you think about the black box of algorithmic decision making, and you think about our track record of using data against people who actually need the government to intervene on behalf of their public good, we've got a really tricky conundrum because we have a bad history, we have bad practice, and what we have now is a more opaque system which makes the governance of this work particularly hard. So there's this category that gathers up these kinds of technology systems, which is referred to as urban platforms. And there's a lot of discussion about platform economy, things like Airbnb and things like Uber, and the promise that they offer for the planning of cities. I would encourage all of us to be open-minded, but also to tread carefully and cautiously. And I'm going to walk you through an example of one that's actually being used. And I'm going to be cheeky, so bear with me, but I'm going to pick on Ottawa because it's the capital and everyone, yeah, anyway, I'm going to tease Ottawa. Okay, who's a recreational cyclist? Who has Strava loaded on a phone, or who uses Strava? Okay, Strava's an app that allows you to track the routes that you ride as a bicyclist or as a runner or even as a walker. Strava's created a company called Strava Metro, and they sell the data sets from the app that they also own to municipalities, and their tagline is better data for better cities. So their argument is the information that their app gathers will help planners and decision makers better plan their cities, largely related to cycling and pedestrian planning. So the city of Ottawa signed a deal with Strava, where Ottawa-Gatineau, the capital region, is going to use their data. I would ask the question, whose data is it? Bear with me if you're a middle-aged man in Lycra. How many of you would identify as a middle-aged man in Lycra with a road bike? One of you. Thanks, Richard. Okay. Most of my friends, because I am a middle-aged woman, their midlife crisis is taking the form of a very sexy, beautiful, expensive road bike. Okay? And lots of my friends use Strava. But if you look, and there are people on Strava, this is just for fun, but there are people on Strava, these are like GIS nerds, who ride bikes. They deliberately ride wacky bike routes so that it shows up in the GIS and they share them. And that's like my kind of, I have no life, but I think that's quite funny. But I don't really want to plan a city's mobility network based on the bike riding habits of wealthy white guys on bikes having a midlife crisis and cheeky people who ride routes like that, okay? I want to plan my city and my bike network based on the data of the people on the left, ordinary people going from point A to point B every day. Okay, and I'm picking on Strava just because it's easy and because people ride bikes around routes that look like bears. But this critique applies to all platform data sets. The data is only good as the places from which it's gathered. As planners, and I hope as architects and landscape architects, one of the things we train our students to ask the question all the time is, who are we missing and how do we find them? You can't tell who you're missing from these kinds of data sets because they're hidden behind proprietary contracts. So if you were, say, Mont-Tremblant, which has a massive triathlon community in the summer, which they use as an economic development prospect, if you were Tremblant, buying Strava data from Tremblant would make a lot of sense because there might be really tight alignment. But if you're Winnipeg or you're Calgary or you're Alberta or you're Upper Rubber Boot, Ontario, which isn't really a place, but you're somewhere small, the Strava data set may not be a good fit. Your ability to evaluate the quality of the data in your planning and design exercise is fundamental, but there are quite significant challenges for you. So when people talk about city as platform, which is what all the big platform purveyors talk about, do not hear it as a proxy for city planning and design. Okay, I'm going to show you something. This slide was presented to us on the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel by the Sidewalk Labs team where they talked about their product development cycle. And this was how they were imagining going through the Quayside process and how they were going to imagine it following its way through the whole design and approval and public consultation process. And I put up my hand and reminded all of them that city building is not product building. Okay, the process of city building and designing and planning is not the same thing as launching a piece of technology. Yes, we can learn from design thinking. Yes, we can reiterate. Yes, we can use agile forms and processes to try to do the work we're going to do. There are all kinds of words that resonate. Iterative design. As designers, we do this kind of work all of the time. But the city's not a product. It's a place where people live. And so we need to be mindful as we start to work with people from technology firms that the language they use to describe their processes is much different than the language we use as planners and designers, but also that their goals and objectives may have some alignment, but it isn't the same thing. And so we need to hold distinct planning and design processes and spaces to ensure that the work is going to happen. Okay, it's been a little bit nerdy, but bear with me because I'm going to go deeper. Does anybody in the room participate in an activity called data scraping? Has anyone ever programmed a piece of technology to gather data from a website and bring it all together? Has anyone done that? Okay, you don't, that's all right. I don't do it either, but I actually study people who do. There's an entire group of people who spend their time gathering data from other places on the internet and repackaging it and either selling it or giving it away. And there are highly valuable data sets that people have a hard time getting access to, which we call the data we want. And I'm going to use Airbnb as a platform, for example. Airbnb is a highly valuable platform full of data that people like me as a planner and maybe folks like you who work on the design side, you'd probably love to get under the hood of Airbnb's engine and see all the data that's in there. But when you use an Airbnb website, you agree to terms of service agreement, which you probably didn't read, which even I don't read and I know better and I should. How many of you just click through the conditions just to get to where you want to go, right? Okay. One of the things you're clicking through is you're clicking through a thing saying that you're not going to use their data without their permission. So if you program a robot to scrape the Airbnb data set, and there are lots of ways to figure out how to do this, you're actually gathering data in a way that's a transgression against their terms of service. You may not care very much, but here's an interesting example from my very own life. I had a master's planning student who wanted to work with scraped Airbnb data to do her master's research paper on housing affordability in Toronto and the role that Airbnb was playing. And I was very excited about this work. And so I went and presented it to our large group research team at a summer institute 4 summers ago. On that research team was the Canada Research Chair whose focus is on data privacy from University of Ottawa Law School, my colleague Teresa Scaza, as well as the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So I get up and I present this, and they're like, you can't do that. I was like, well, why? They're like, it's illegal. And I was like, what? Like, you can't scrape data. I had no idea. So then we had this interesting conundrum because I had a planning student in a planning school that's accredited. So we're a professional planning school like yours is, and I'm a registered professional planner. And then I went back and looked at the code of practice and the code of ethics for my field and asked the question, as a registered professional planner, am I allowed to work with illegally gathered data sets? And the illegality is, it's not entirely tested, so there's a bit of a gray space. So what do you do if you're a registered professional and you don't know what's possible? You go to your professional organization and you start asking questions. So I type up this email and send it off to the Ontario Professional Planning Institute. And I wasn't there when the registrar opened the email, but I'm pretty sure he had no idea what the hell I was talking about when I asked him if I was allowed to work with scraped data or if my student was allowed to work with scraped data inside the confines of my professional accreditation. And so it began this big adventure, which also led me talking to the American Institute of Certified Planners, and they have no idea either. So here we are in practice. We have platform companies like Uber and Airbnb who are sitting on a gold mine of data that would really help us be able to plan and design our cities better, and we're not legally able to access it. And municipalities worldwide are hacking around it. In Berlin, one of the things they did was they used scraped Airbnb data to figure out where the Airbnbs were, and then they went and they put their bylaw officers in locations to catch people accessing the Airbnb as their way of trapping people. It seems a little bit like entrapment, but apparently it works in Germany. In California, they did the same thing, and then they used the human-to-human observation to then get a subpoena for the data. So people have worked their way around it, but we've got this really big asymmetry between private sector firms having massive amounts of data that are highly valuable, and their business model in part thrives because we are building and designing amazing communities where people actually want to go and travel and live. But the people on the government side can't get access to that data. So this is an interesting conundrum. Next strange data thing. If you thought scrape data was weird, this one might be even stranger. Who knows what wastewater epidemiology is? Does anybody know? Okay, I'm just giving you all this nerdy stuff for today. There is technology now being used by Statistics Canada, among other organizations, where governments and private sector firms are capturing wastewater, so water that comes out of toilets and showers and dishwashers in houses, and they're analyzing it, and they're analyzing it for a bunch of purposes. In the case of Statistics Canada, they did a study in 2018 and 2019 where they were trying to understand how much weed people are smoking in Canadian cities, and so they were able to measure how much weed people were smoking by the presence of THC, COOH in wastewater in Canadian sewer systems. People smoke more weed per capita in Halifax, apparently, than anywhere else in Canada. Montreal second, Toronto third. You're not even on here, so I don't know what that says about Winnipeg, but you didn't make the top 5. This is a really interesting thing for me as a planner, because I would ask you the question, when you go to the bathroom, are you thinking, I'm making a data deposit? Probably not, right? No big deal, really. You know, the argument is, I have nothing to hide. I actually think that's rubbish. I think all of us are infinitely more complicated than we talk about. But can you imagine a public health situation, for example, in any Canadian community with people who are struggling with opioid addiction and are worried about getting in trouble? If people who have opioid addiction challenges start being afraid to use sanitary sewer systems for fear of being caught, what we're going to have is a massive public health crisis, because we're going to see proliferation of hepatitis and TB, for example, if people start using public spaces instead of sanitary sewers to go to the bathroom. Okay? So am I saying, you know, this wastewater epidemiology technology is cool because they can also check viral load. They've been able in the States to model, for example, flu virus transmittals. So having access to wastewater epidemiology data right now might be super helpful in the middle of this coronavirus crisis. But I would argue, if we're going to move down this road, people need to participate with informed consent. There needs to be a civic conversation about the fact that wastewater may be gathered. It's being gathered at the 1 to 10,000 household scale, so it's highly anonymized. But if you can stick a robot in a sewer at a main sewer trunk, you also have the capacity to stick the robot in the sewer where your individual house attaches to the sewer line. Okay, and so I'm not saying don't do it, but what I'm saying is the arrival of these kinds of technologies presents new challenges for us, and what we really need with these kinds of urban platforms and these massive data sets are new governance structures. One of the things that's coming, if it isn't already on your radar, is this notion of data trusts. There are experiments happening worldwide. Cities like Barcelona and London and New York have this coalition for digital rights where they're starting to talk about who gets to own the data, how is it gathered, where does it sit, and who has access to it. Data trusts are one of the most common interventions that you might start to see, and I'm sharing this paper by my colleague and friend Bianca Wiley. If you're interested in it, I can help you find it or I can send it around. But it's probably good as a designer or as a planner to start to learn a little bit about data governance, because these kinds of scenarios in which new technology will present both opportunity and potential challenge on behalf of the public good are going to present themselves. So you don't need to be an expert, but you do need to think about it. Okay, so up until now, I focused on increasingly strange and arcane futuristic data and technology-driven solutions. I'm going to switch to something totally analog when we think about this question of what does the future look like and are we positioning ourselves properly in terms of our practice. And I'm going to go to something really basic. This is my backyard in Toronto. And I want to ask you the question, what if I wanted to put up a shed in my backyard instead of putting up a snowman? What would I need to do? Well, in Toronto, we have something called the Committee of Adjustment. My understanding is in Manitoba, it's called the Variance Committee. Richard, is that right? There's a committee, Winnipeg has one. I looked at its agenda.
It's somewhere in between those two.
Yeah, so if you want to build something in your backyard and it doesn't meet the side yard and the rear yard setbacks, or it's too high or it's too dense, you have to seek planning relief, because people like me
planners a long time ago went and invented this system where we care about what happens in these kinds of spaces in very detailed ways, sometimes down to 2 decimal places. Okay, so say the shed I wanted to build wasn't in line with the zoning bylaw, what would I have to do? Well, you'd have to, as an ordinary citizen, understand the zoning bylaw, maybe get some plans drawn and get a survey too. The clock represents an investment of time, the emoji is how much is an investment of money. Then you have to apply. To get a minor variance in Toronto costs about $1,500 and it takes between 8 and 12 weeks to get in front of the committee. Then you have to wait. Then you need to go to the committee. We did actually seek a minor variance on our house, not for a shed, but for a 3rd floor. I refused to represent us and my neighbors because planners shouldn't plan their own houses, so we had to pay our architect to go and do it. Then we had to wait some more, then we had a decision, then somebody could appeal or not, and then the decision would maybe be yes or no. So I'm gonna ask you the question, if we had to start all over again, would we really, given the climate emergency, given affordable housing challenges, given transit and mobility crises, given tremendous income inequality, would we ever design a city building process that cares about whether or not your shed in your backyard is 2 centimeters too close to where your neighbor is? I would argue as a planner, this is one of the most fundamental things we need to rethink, because if you look at how much time and money is going into this, I would ask the question, is there value added in this process? We do have situations in which people take advantage of things on private property that have impact on neighbors, but do we need to design a system that anticipates conflict from the beginning? Do we need to design a system that requires all this professional attention? There's planners, lawyers, and architects all involved here, along with bureaucrats. There's an exchange of money. There's a long delay of time. All of this for a shed? Is it worth it? Is this the best use of public attention on civic issues? I would argue, given the extent of what's coming, both technological and environmental, probably not. And so when we think about the changing nature of cities, one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves is, in a rapidly changing city or community, are we focusing on the right things? And one of the things I think that's important for us to remember is that the story of community is the story of change. Many communities are changing because they're growing. Some communities are changing because they're shrinking. But this notion of standing still isn't really something that is common across communities. Most communities are engaging in some kind of change. And I think we need to ask ourselves, as both learners and people who deliver design and planning education, are our schools keeping up? So when we think about the future, as students, do you feel like you're ready for future practice? Do you know what you need help with? Do you know the things that you don't know? What are you excited about, but also what scares you? What ideas do you have as an individual, and what are we going to be able to do together? As a planning educator, and now as the director of the planning school, these are the kinds of questions I literally think about every day when I'm teaching in my classroom, when I'm walking my dog, when I'm out and about all the time. And I'm really challenged when I think about the future of design and planning education, because do you know that old adage, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail? When you're trained to do one thing, you use one solution. But given the complexity and the emergence of issues that are coming, including, where's Thomas? I know he's in the room, our keynote from last night. If you were here for Thomas's keynote last night, Thomas talked about how important it is to embrace the principles of ecosystem diversity and emergence in the ways in which we design and practice planning. If you only think about things through your one lens, we're not respecting that dynamic nature of the way in which we work. And so I would argue that maybe our future city building toolkit is much more plural. We're using different kinds of skills, different kinds of tools to work on a wider range of solutions. So when we think about what the future of our teaching and practice will look like, there are a few things I want to highlight as I start to wrap up this talk. There are tensions that we're going to confront. Increasingly, what we're seeing is pressure on government to move faster. But sometimes moving faster isn't always the right thing. We don't want to be necessarily bureaucratic, but sometimes slower processes are good. In city building processes, slower processes are often ones that are democratic and inclusive. Okay, you might think, oh, well, we all got devices in our pocket. We can use technology to expand civic engagement and civic participation. Well, if you can't reach all of the people that you need to reach through the technology you have, if some people in your community only get access to the internet for 20 minutes a week on a public library computer, how good is your public consultation process going to be? It might be great for people your age, but it might exclude people from other income brackets, or from other literacy levels, or other first language groups, or other socioeconomic groups. So we have to balance the desire to move quickly with the recognition that sometimes slow means more inclusive, but also deliberative is better. In England, there's a huge push out of the digital service to engage in something called lean policy making, which is about changing policy in real time. Can you imagine if the Winnipeg City Plan was changing in real time? I don't know what your history of harebrained ideas are. Toronto has a long history of really stupid ideas that were very popular for about 20 minutes and then they went away. If we let those things happen in the moment, our city would be even more messed up than it already is. Like we'd have a Ferris wheel, for example, on the waterfront, courtesy of the premier and his brother, who was the mayor of our city. So fast isn't always good. Sometimes fast is really good. You know, get rid of committee of adjustment maybe, or design a different system, that would be faster, but in other cases, maybe not. When do we innovate things and when do we maintain? With technological advancement, there's this tremendous pressure to be innovative. Richard and I had a conversation in the car about what does good innovation look like. Sometimes maintaining what you have is really important. In infrastructure management, there's this principle called the principle of the state of good repair. You need to have a capital budget that allows you to maintain your infrastructure system in good repair. Sometimes that's a really good thing, but sometimes we need disruption and we need to invest in new things. Learning to balance that tension really matters. When we think about tall timber, one of the ways in which tall timber or mass timber is being sold is that it's more sustainable and it's more economical. I'm not hearing conversations about the maintenance regime related to tall timber. There's some suggestion that in tall timber buildings you have to sand the building every 5 years. So what you might save on capital costs, you then boost on operating costs. If you're using mass timber to create affordable housing structures, maybe it's cheaper to build, but you're actually creating a much more expensive maintenance regime, which is ultimately either going to be borne by the people who are paying the rent or the government who's providing the rent or rent subsidy or both. Is that a good decision? I don't know, but we need to start thinking about this tension between innovation and maintenance. Will things be opened or will they be closed? There's a huge push for open data in Canada, and I'm on the federal government's open data strategy, so I'm a big believer in open. I've talked about the challenges of closed systems, but not all data sets can be open. People's private data around healthcare, for example, need to be protected to the nth degree because that's our most vital information. So there are tensions in this changing landscape around open and closed. There are also tensions in our practices between open and closed around professionals and the work that they do that we need to be thinking about. Okay, I'll talk about that with many experts in a minute. There's also a tension between things being static and things being dynamic. As a planner, we train planners to write plans, which are static documents mostly, that then get imposed on dynamic changing cities. There's a real tension there between how do we create plans that have enough vision that people know where they're headed, but can also be responsive in real time, that also don't step on the toes of the fast versus slow situation, which I just talked about a few minutes ago. So there are interesting challenges in the way in which we work, recognizing the complexity of the communities in which we're working. We're going to see more experts. When we talk about allied professionals in planning school, the most common ones we ream off are the kinds of schools that you guys are in. We talk about architects, we talk about landscape architects, civil engineers sometimes, and planners. Now, increasingly, some of my allied professionals are computer scientists. None of us are really trained to work with people. I don't just mean people who rock on Rhino, like people who can actually write code, okay? People who can work with machine learning technology. People like us need to start talking to people like them, and they really need to start talking to us because our code of practice really has a public interest and a sustainability piece embedded in it that they aren't necessarily exposed to. We need to continue to be really good at working across scales. One of our biggest collective assets, in my experience, is to be able to toggle between big picture and nitty-gritty on the ground in real time with real people in a room, and to be able to tell the impacts of decisions across scales, both visually and orally. Okay, we are good storytellers in our work. We use different outputs to tell our stories, but we're very good at that. Increasingly over time, we need to up our capacity to tell complex stories in ways that are simple but not simplistic, that are clear but not patronizing, and we need to be able to do it across scales. We also need to think about new processes. The most obvious one confronting my practice right now in Toronto is the plan that Sidewalk Labs has created is eventually, if it gets approved, will go to the City of Toronto. We don't have a mechanism right now that effectively layers the digital layer with the land use layer. So there's no digital master planning process that's actually been built yet. We have things that the city is thinking about things and they haven't released what they look like yet, but we need to start thinking about how do we present digital technology on a plan in a way that it can receive the same consideration that other forms of infrastructure receive. Other forms of infrastructure go through an environmental assessment process, which has peer-reviewed evidence and public hearings and is transparent. It's not perfect, but we know how to do it. I would argue that maybe there's a variation on the environmental impact assessment process that includes technology that at least allows us to start figuring out what happens when technology meets the land. We're going to have to start working with new tools, which I've talked about a lot. And most importantly, the thing that we're going to have to think about is how do we ask harder questions, and how, even more importantly, do we get better at delivering better answers. So I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to do one more slide. This is an obnoxious, shameless plug, but I'm going to go for it anyway because I'm up here and you're out there. Our planning school is hiring a new colleague. We have a tenure track position in Indigenous planning and design. It's up here. If this is remotely in the space in which you work, if you know anyone who you think might be interested in a position like that, have them please reach out to me. We're really super psyched about having a new colleague come, but I'm taking advantage of being in another province and in a new place to help spread the word. So harder questions, better answers. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody, my name is Sarah Cooper and I teach in the City Planning Department.
I don't think I actually introduced myself earlier, so I'm Richard Miller, I'm the head of the departments in planning, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's Anglia, because they are the discussants.
So first of all, thank you very much, Pamela, for the talk this morning. I appreciated so many of the things that you raised. The whole relationship between technology and cities is not something that I've thought about very much, even though it's such an emerging area. So many new potential opportunities and also challenges that come out of that. One of the things that I wrote down that I thought was really interesting, kind of a theme throughout your talk, was the tension between corporate interests and the public interest, right? Like this is a thing that we talk about a lot in planning. Is like, first of all, who is the public? Is there more than one? So who are the publics? Who are the public interests? There are multiple. And then to put that into conversation with corporate interests, the question of governments. Who do governments represent? Do they represent all the people that we maybe think they should represent? Do they only represent certain people? I don't know. But yeah, that's a very interesting tension, and drawing it out through this question of technology is fascinating. It comes up in all different kinds of places too. And then the point about asking these bigger questions about the kinds of cities that we really want to have, which is fundamentally what this is about, right? What should the cities that we live in look like? What are our priorities for the cities that we live in? What are the values that we want to put forward for our cities? How do we want to build cities that are based on, for me, I would like to see socially just cities, cities that are equitable, cities that provide opportunity for everybody. Those are not necessarily everyone's priorities. That's fine, we can have conversations about that. These different priorities, these different values result in, different tensions sometimes. Sometimes those can be productive tensions. We can have useful, good conversations that come out of them. They can also be challenging when you get certain interests that maybe also have more power. It's interesting in my classes, I often ask the students, okay, well, here's this real world planning situation. How would you deal with it? And one of their most common responses is, well, we need to communicate better. We need to talk more. We need to, and that's not wrong. That's completely true. We do need to talk more. You raised a number of different areas that we could communicate better on. We could raise new questions. We could look at various issues from different perspectives. But there also are times and places where the talking isn't going to get anywhere. I'm thinking right now of British Columbia with the Wet'suwet'en territory with coastal gas, what's it called, coastal line? I don't know, the gas pipeline that's going through there. The First Nations in the area, the hereditary chiefs have said, no, this is not happening. And Canada has said, well, that's all fine and good, but we want to put this pipeline here. And I don't think that, particularly with the RCMP moving in and arresting people, that any conversation, any more talking is necessarily going to solve that problem. There needs to be another process in place to recognize the different perspectives of what is actually happening in that moment. I'll stop there for the moment. I probably could talk more, but I won't.
Okay. I would say my overall question is talking about more about the urban planning in the school scenario, the school sense. Coming from my background is not being in city planning, but I'm in my last year of my undergrad and we haven't been introduced to a lot of the terms about city planning and a lot of the topics that you were talking about. And I feel like there's a little bit of a distance between the city planning and the architecture and design in the school system, where I was wondering your outlook on that. And do you find that you ask the question, do we feel ready when we come out of this? Do you find that the city planners are ready when they go to school? And do you find that maybe we need a little bit more overlap between city planners understanding more of the design aspect that we go through, but then also us understanding more of the realm? Because it should be mixed a little bit more, and I find them very distant.
Thanks. I'll speak to both. I'll go to Leah's question first about education. So I think one of the things that we all just need to make peace with is that we can't be all things to all people. And so if you think about, so it's okay if you don't feel prepared, like no one's really ready, but the thing as a person coming out of school that you can really start to think about in a thoughtful way is, what do you have to offer? What are the things you know, but also what are the limits of your education? So I'm not suggesting you have to pretend like you know things that you don't, but really being able to situate yourself in the expertise or the experience, whether it's lived or gained through school or in the workplace that you bring, is an important first step. Because once you know where you are, then you can figure out where you want to go. And you can go back to school, you can do lifelong learning, you could go to a civic hack night that Winnipeg has. There are all kinds of ways you can get engaged if you want to. So no one's ever going to have all the things. City building is really kind of like the best potluck, right? Bring your best dish. That's what you got to figure out, is what are you really good at? I clearly like to cook, but what can you bring and what can you offer? I think that planners, like designers, we come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I know that your school and my school both really center studio-based planning learning as a way of trying to help planners move beyond just talking and criticizing things into the fray of actually doing things. And one of the things that I think that unites all of our collective disciplines is that we don't just sit and imagine what's wrong. We critique what's wrong, and then we take the skills we have and we start to try to affect change on the ground. And that's a very powerful distinction. To your point about imperfect solutions, one of the things when we're recruiting planning students I talk about is that you have to be really comfortable in knowing that it's probably never going to be as good as you hoped it would be, because that's just democracy and that's politics, right? And I have colleagues who talk about smart cities as being tools of the neoliberal state, which they probably are, but in the end, there's capitalism and there's people and here's planning in the middle, and we're trying to juggle in between. And so we're constantly mediating. So we train our students. They do design-related work, but they also can do a pro forma where they can run the math on how much it costs to build stuff on a piece of land. So we're trying to build their skill sets the best we can, but not every school can do everything for all people. In Ontario, our working relationship with Indigenous communities of people is in a much different place than, say, it is in anywhere west of Ontario. So where we have some things where maybe like my students know about weird technology stuff because they have to sit with me, we have more work to do. We're hiring an Indigenous colleague because we have lots of work to do there, right? So the work of being good at the thing you're good at is never ending. Our professions will tell us that's why we do continuous professional learning credits, but don't be daunted by what you don't know. Just be committed to a continuous process of learning. Sarah, to your point about about conversation. You know, when my students say, if people just knew more, they behave differently, I'm like, smoking. Everybody knows smoking will kill you, but people smoke for a whole bunch of reasons, right? So I'm not anti-knowledge, but it's one piece of a larger trajectory. I would say that if I could draw one conclusion midstream about Canadian cities' experience with smart cities so far, is that there's this huge mirror back on all the governance work that we didn't do that we should have done before. You can't figure out what role technology and data can play if you don't have a good plan and democratically agreed upon principles and values that matter. Because if you don't have a plan, the vendor's going to be like, hey, buy this cool thing. And you'll be like, oh, cool, right? Rather than be like, hey, that cool thing has nothing to do with these 5 things that really matter to us. So we need to really double down on democratic processes. We kind of lost the art, I would argue, of good civic participation and good. We don't even know how to talk to each other anymore. We can tweet at each other, you know, we control, we can snark, but having a meaningful, sustained conversation about hard things, and that's hard work, but technology's not helping us get better at that. So it's even more daunting now, I think, but I totally agree with you that we need to have better conversations that lead to action. But you know, if people are, you know, people's inherent racism and bias, it's in the algorithm, but it's in the civic conversations too. So we all need to learn to appreciate where we're coming from and being better at being human to build better communities together.
I have a couple of thoughts that, well, my somewhat crass question is, do smart cities make dumb citizens? And, you know, because we don't know how they work. And I have two sort of slightly different thoughts that that's coming from. And one is ecological, and particularly Michael Huff's idea of cities a natural process, and that citizens really need to understand how natural processes work, but we hide them in cities so people don't understand them. The other thing I've been reading recently, Richard Sanafle's book, I don't know if you've seen it, Cities, and he makes many of the same same points, especially around open and closed systems. But one of the studies he cites, which I found really interesting, was they tested 2 different groups playing a computer game, and one of them was a glitch-free version, and one was a very glitchy version. And the people who played the game better were the ones who played the glitchy version, because they got to understand what was going on. They had to think about what was going on. And, you know, I look at the Google stuff, and I think, you know, in the black Lego box, but, you know, we don't know how it works. If it works smoothly, everyone goes, oh, isn't this great? When it doesn't work smoothly, no one knows what to do with it.
I have a mic. If I use this, you can hear me, right? I was like, I have all the mics now. This question of, do smart cities make dumb citizens? Okay, so at the risk of sounding self-promotional, we just published a paper about the transactional citizens. So citizens aren't dumb, but they're reduced to the sum of the things that they do to interact with technology, like the number of tweets, the number of likes, the number of clicks. I would argue that as planners and designers, if we don't fundamentally believe that people have important and vital things to say, then you have no place in the profession you're doing. Like this fundamental commitment to there is value and wisdom in the public is one of the central relationship elements. And the technology for sure gets in the way of that. It makes it easier not to do the hard work of talking to people. It makes it easier to use proxies. I didn't even talk about, there's a whole, well, everyone who's an architect probably works with digital twins or synthetic alternatives to the real life thing where you like build a digital version that's supposed to mirror what's happening in real life and you monkey around with that, right? That process is only as good as the data that goes in, and it's one thing to build a digital twin of a bridge, it's an entirely different thing to build a digital twin of a city and how people move around it and start to make assumptions around that. And so not only does the technology make it harder to understand the wisdom of citizens sometimes, which seems counterintuitive, but it also, as you know, it makes it opaque in terms of understanding how good the outputs are. And so I think, you know, there's lots of good precedent from Huff, Jamie Pottinger's book about landscape narratives and revealing and unmasking. Those kinds of narratives that predate all of this technology are very important. You know, what is a legible city? You know, Lynch's ideas are super relevant in the context of smart cities. Like, all the old good city building stuff still matters, but it's easy to forget it because it's not new anymore, right? Yeah. So, I would agree.
I understand what you're talking about how technology makes the face-to-face conversation diminish a little bit, but don't you think it also maybe broadens the top of the realm of the conversation? Like, I have a conversation with someone halfway across the world, and it gives a voice to a lot of people that maybe didn't have voices at some point. So as much as we still need to work on like, the communication skills, but I think there's a positive to some of it, that it might, there is many more people that are getting their voices out there and their opinions are being heard because of the technology that might actually help and benefit.
I think that when you think about the role of technology in public conversation, you really need to embrace the yes and proposition. So there's not one technique for having a public conversation. We need the old ways of doing and new ways of doing too. I would argue that technology has extended inclusion opportunities to particular groups of people, but not all people. And so younger people, for example, may be much more inclined to participate online, which is awesome. So if you want to do something youth-related, going online is probably going to make a lot of sense. But you need to make sure that the young people that you want to reach actually have access to the tools you want. And people who have the most access to technology forget what it's like to not have access to technology. And so we really, like in Toronto, the public library is one of the most important portals for people in terms of accessing the internet and accessing free Wi-Fi. And when the libraries close, you'll often see teenagers sitting on the steps out front bumping off the Wi-Fi because it's free and they can still use it outside the walls of the building. There are tons of positive things that technology has done. Civic technology groups across North America routinely meet once a week to create apps that help make their communities better. There's one called Get Cal Fresh, for example, that comes out of a civic tech group in California where the process of getting access to food stamps is like ridiculously complicated. Their app narrowed down the complex process into a series of 10 questions that helps you understand if you're eligible very quickly, which then for people who are eligible helps them get better access to the food stamps that they need to have access to fresh and healthy food. So I don't want to say it's all negative at all. It's just, it's not as good generically as everyone says it's going to be. We can't just be like, oh wow, it's awesome. It could be great in one situation or in many situations with particular people, but it's not going to instantly fix all the things that we find challenging in everyday practice. So it's really nuanced, I would say. It's more like acupuncture than blanket. Yeah. I can just wander around the room and be a human microphone.
Hi, so I'm a student in environmental design, still in my second year. So my question is, in your expertise, I'm sure you come across the elephant in the room, which is politics, and the role that they play in city planning, urban design, and just design in general. And here in school, like, we're prepared to enter the field and imagine scenarios of sustainable, healthy communities. But there's often kind of like a disconnect between the real world and what you learned. I don't think it's bad, but it's good just for you to be prepared. But what do you think is an alternative way to be prepared in order to actually face the real world in that sense and just challenge politics and policies in general?
What's your name?
I'm Nora.
Hi, nice to meet you. So I'm going to nudge back just a little bit on this equating what happens on campus to not being the real world. People who, like, I get so frustrated when people are like, you don't do anything real. I'm like, that's rubbish. Like, I do real things all the time. And so what you're doing right now on campus is really real and it's vital. So don't be too stressed. But you're at the beginning of a process of broader learning. I think there are a bunch of things that can happen. One of the things is that you can, as a student, use this amazing laboratory that is the city of Winnipeg as a place to test your own learning. And so making time to go to public meetings, making time to participate in something. I know everyone's busy and people have jobs and it takes you a while to get here on the bus probably every day. Like, I know your life is busy, but trying to at least engage in the community around you will help to start you better appreciate the difference between the big ideas and how things land on the ground.
But things land on the ground differently everywhere all the time. And so learning how to think big and learning how to embrace complex ideas here, it's a luxury of being a student where not everything you do has to work. You get to try, and you get to, you can try an idea out, and if it's not good, you can figure it out here and no harm is going to happen. So it may not feel like there's luxury in learning spaces on campus, but being able to think big and freely is such a gift, because later on, if you go into private practice, you're going to have to bill your client on 6-minute increments to get paid. That's like the opposite of what you get to do here. So this is very real, but it may not seem practical. On the education side, I'll share a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, which is it really bugs me, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm criticizing myself among others. How much wasted energy there is in assignments where the audience is two people, the student and the person doing the marking. And so I was trying to quantify actually how much time goes into writing essays, and it's really important to learn how to write, and the research that goes into essays is really important, but if we could even unlock a piece of that energy in broader civic purpose, wholly renewable resources, because since the beginning of time, professors have made students do assignments, right? So I think about the embodied energy in assignments. I have this fantasy, I'll throw it out here, maybe it'll stick here because no one's listening to me in Toronto. I think about statistics education. How many of you had to take basic stats as so you had to do some math? I have this fantasy in our planning school that we're going to introduce service learning into our stats course, where part of what our students will do is they will go sit at a library at a desk that says, ask me a stats question or ask me a math question, and our students will work with members of the public to answer their data questions. Because then the math, for people who don't love it, would mean something, right? So I think a lot, to your point about how can we help you use your experience on campus to make better contributions off campus. First of all, being a learner is vitally important, but I think by being creative and thinking about how people spend their time, not everything is going to be like that, and there's really good value in learning how to write a paper, but maybe one of those papers of 10 might have a wider audience in some way. And we are increasingly moving to a wider range of assignments, for example, in the way in which we teach. Does that answer your question? Yeah, cool. Okay.
Hello, I have a question about this. Kind of back to what Richard was saying about smart cities and dumb citizens in that way. More along the lines of the power dynamics of the technologies we're working with or being pressed upon us, and who, should we be giving so much of our, the qualities of our citizenship in some respects to the Jeff Bezoses and the Zuckerbergs and the Sergey Brins of the world? Is that?
Yeah, and this picks up on Sarah's earlier point about the relationship between the state, the private sector, and civil society. There is so much private sector profit-taking from public realm and public good that we don't have accounting. But aside from the fact that those massive companies don't pay taxes pretty much anyway, but cities themselves are the platforms on which they're making profit. And so we need to find new mechanisms in the most crass way to tax the good that they're getting, because they are extracting more than they are giving. One of the things I'm working with in my own research right now is, I don't know what the Manitoba Aggregate Resources Act looked like, but in Ontario, aggregates like rocks and gravel and sand extraction, the Aggregate Resources Act in Ontario is one of the most powerful pieces of provincial government legislation. It sits above all kinds of public priorities. When mining companies come and take things away, they have to remediate a site to a certain point of ecological standards. I've been thinking about that as a parallel for data companies and platform companies. They are extracting, and they come and they experiment, and what happens when they fail? What's the base condition that they have to restore the environment to before they're allowed to go, before we sue them and send them into insolvency? These kinds of questions are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. I'm not particularly well equipped to do it because I'm not a lawyer, but I am using planning parallels around extraction to think about that. And so the power asymmetries are tremendous. The example I gave about the data is only one of many. And we have to be very mindful of it, but it gets increasingly hard, to Sarah's earlier point, to do the work, because now government is co-producing these kinds of projects with private sector firms. And so government is supposed to intervene on markets on behalf of the public good, but if they're the partner in these projects, then who's there?
kind of all of us with our professional, like we're it, which, you know, we're kind of awesome, but we're not that awesome. Like we have a lot, like we need some more company and we need some more protection. And more importantly, our communities of people need more protection.
Sorry, I have one follow-up. Sure. Would be that is part of the problem that kind of the tech speak, like embedding itself into design thinking maybe, or like it's like techifying, and like is Google actually interested in building like a nice city, or are they just interested in building a better surveillance system for their data? Like,
So I'm not gonna,
are they urbanist at all?
I don't work for them, but I think it's a good question, and those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask them, right? But again, in the moment of like, because we are all reflecting together, we have to be a little bit careful about critiquing tech companies for using complex, opaque language, because we're all pretty guilty of that too. Designers, I know, put up very beautiful pictures that are complicated and look amazing, and nobody normal can understand what they say. My profession uses stupid language that nobody understands to make things more complex. So we all have work to do in the clear narrative department. They're guilty, but so are we on that one, hey? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I have I've been to Dubai, so the cyber cop reference was quite interesting to me, because you don't have to be there very long before you realize you're in a surveillance society. The cyber cop just adds to that. My question has to do with AI and your feelings about AI directed at things like policing. More particularly, how do we get to a point where we're developing AI for cities that's based on multiple objectives as opposed to the singular objectives of policing, for example? And how do we incorporate, or if we're going to go down this path, I think we really have to expand our notion of what AI is doing to be less specific and broader in terms of social agendas, etc.
So I would say that based on what we've seen so far with predictive policing, what it suggests to me is that we need to hurry up in terms of getting our regulatory house in order to figure out how do we actually warp the technology applications to fit the social objectives and the ecological objectives that we need. So before we scale up AI and let it loose on bigger, more complex systems, it's not even working on single-use systems very well right now, right? So I'm not in a hurry to see it scaled up, because we don't even know what to do with the stuff we have right now. You're seeing, City of New York had a task force on algorithmic governance, where they're bringing together people to try to understand what to do with the procurement of these kinds of technology tools. Some private sector firms are creating in-house ethics boards. Facebook's got some new incarnation of people who are going to attempt to figure out what's allowed on the platform and what's not. It's super early days, so I would say, we have a lot of really complicated issues that need to be solved and need addressing. I worry that AI could suck all the oxygen out of other important, broader conversations. AI tools are only one of many. There are lots of things that we know how to do that don't involve that kind of technology at all, that we're not confronting. So I'm not so keen on this scaling up until we get our house in order. But no one really has the answer on how to do that yet. But we need more prototyping of the kinds of interventions that we're starting to see pop up episodically. But we need academics and other evaluators to study them before we let it loose at large.
My name is Dietmar. I want to talk about gold. Let's claim the gold. Data seems to be the new gold.
Okay.
What I learned, my piece data. I need a washroom soon. Maybe I should wait for the best offers here. It's data. What I knew, because when I go for my physio, my doctor was always asking for a class, so I knew a little bit about that.
Okay.
That contains information. Some people knew the P was fertilizer as well. So my question for you is smart cities, maybe also smart landscapes. It seems to be logical that smart is correlated to high tech.
Yeah.
Maybe old knowledge, you are looking for indigenous position, old knowledge.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it low tech.
No.
Could be smart as well. What's the role of old knowledge to create smart landscapes and or smart cities, in your opinion?
It's vital. I mean, this is the part of the moving fast is that we default to things that are technology based, right? But, you know, working with elders, for example, in community, that's not a fast process, but it's a vitally rich one. I mean, if you think about the Franklin expedition, it's like, you know, an obvious pop culture. How much money did people spend trying to find a boat that the indigenous people knew were there all the time anyway, but no one ever asked them? Like, that's a really, I mean, I just laughed at the hubris of people down south and men and their expedition fantasies. It was like, it was hilarious, and to just be like, it's right there. Like, we could have told you, you just didn't respect us enough to ask us, right? So, yeah, we need to uncork all kinds of knowledge that's place-based, and not displace it with the stuff that comes out of the black box algorithm. But that's not sexy, right? And it's also gendered, and it has a cultural piece to it, where what do we value? We value different kinds of things, but not those kinds of things, so we need to change our value proposition. I'm with you. I'm not advocating that we should be going down the technology where technology is needed and valuable, but not instead of all things, 100%.
Additional table for discussion? Oh, question from the floor, one more?
One last one. How do we then defend the things that we have done well, like public transit is not a sexy idea, like Uber is cannibalizing that.
Yeah.
How do we defend then the things that we have through a fairly long time span of experience and data, defend from becoming eaten alive?
It comes back, at the end of the day, decisions are still taken by politicians, and politicians are still elected by humans, not robots. And so I think it's now more than ever, or as much as ever, the strength of community engagement and local democracy really matters, keeping in mind to the narrative of change that it's not just about voting, because like in my city, 20% of adults over the age of 18 can't vote because they aren't Canadian citizens. So it's not just about the power of the vote if we want to be inclusive, it's about the power of the people and the numbers of the people and the ways in which they assert and assemble that power in it, voting and other things too. So.
Thanks, Pamela. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Sarah and Leah. We'll move on to the next program. Thank you for the forum.